Everybody loves somebody sometime.
December 25th, 1995. Christmas morning. While families across America gathered around Christmas trees and opened presents, Dean Martin lay alone in his Beverly Hills home, his breathing shallow and labored. His housekeeper had just checked on him. His daughter Deanna was on her way. But in those final moments before dawn broke on Christmas Day, Dean was alone with his thoughts, his memories, and the weight of 8 years of grief he'd carried since losing his son. The nurses later reported that Dean's final words, whispered in the early morning darkness, were heartbreaking in their simplicity. He wasn't thinking about his legendary career, his fame, or his fortune. He was thinking about the people he'd lost, and the reunion he hoped was waiting. What Dean Martin said in his final moments reveals the truth about what really matters when our time runs out. And it will change how you think about love, loss, and the legacies we leave behind. Before we explore Dean Martin's final day and the words that broke everyone's hearts, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This isn't just about a Hollywood legend. It's about what we all face at the end and what truly matters when everything else fades away. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and let's honor Dean's memory together. The man behind the cool persona. For decades, Dean Martin was the embodiment of effortless cool. The smooth crooner with a martini glass and an easy smile. The member of the Rat Pack who seemed like he didn't have a care in the world. The guy who made everything look easy, singing, acting, comedy, life itself. But that image hid a much more complex reality. Dean Martin, born Dino Paul Crocetti in Steubenville, Ohio, was the son of Italian immigrants. He grew up poor, worked as a blackjack dealer and a boxer before making it in show business. The cool, carefree persona was something he created, a shield against a world that could be cruel and unforgiving. Those who knew Dean best understood that beneath the smooth exterior was a deeply private man who felt things intensely but rarely showed it. He loved his children fiercely. He mourned losses deeply. And he carried pain that most people never saw. The loss that broke him. March 21st, 1987. That was the day everything changed for Dean Martin. His son, Dean Paul Martin, was piloting an F-4 Phantom jet fighter for the California Air National Guard when it crashed into Mount San Gorgonio during a training mission. Dean Paul was 35 years old, a talented pilot, a loving father, and Dean's pride and joy. The news devastated Dean. Friends later said they'd never seen him cry until that day. Frank Sinatra was with him when he got the call. The light just went out of him, Frank said later. Right there, in that moment, Dean died too. His body kept going for 8 more years, but his spirit was gone. Dean Paul had been more than just Dean's son. He was Dean's golfing partner, his confidant, his friend. They'd talk on the phone almost every day. They'd play golf together every week. Dean Paul called his father Dino, and could make the notoriously reserved Dean laugh like nobody else could. After the crash, Dean became a different person. The man who'd performed hundreds of shows a year suddenly couldn't bring himself to go on stage. The social butterfly who'd been the life of every party became a recluse. The smooth entertainer who'd made millions of people laugh and sing along couldn't find joy in anything anymore. The 8 years of decline. From 1987 to 1995, Dean Martin slowly withdrew from the world. He completed his existing contract obligations, finishing his concert tour because he'd given his word. But once those were done, he retreated to his Beverly Hills mansion and rarely came out. Friends tried to reach him. Frank Sinatra called constantly. Shirley MacLaine visited when Dean would let her. His daughters Deanna, Gail, and Gina came by regularly. But Dean had built walls that even love couldn't fully penetrate. He spent his days watching old westerns on television, smoking cigarettes, and drinking Jack Daniels. Though those who saw him said he wasn't really drinking to get drunk anymore. He was just going through the motions of being Dean Martin, the character he'd played for so long. His health deteriorated steadily. Emphysema from decades of smoking made breathing difficult. His kidneys were failing. He'd had several small strokes that affected his memory and mobility. But Dean refused most medical intervention. "What's the point?" he'd tell his doctors. "Just let me be." His children watched helplessly as their father faded. Deanna later wrote about how painful it was to see Dean, this larger-than-life figure who'd commanded stages and dominated screens, become a frail old man who shuffled through his house in his bathrobe, barely eating, barely speaking, just waiting. He was waiting to die, Deanna said in interviews years later. After Dean Paul died, Dad was just waiting until he could be with him again. Nothing we did or said could change that. The final months. By late 1995, it was clear Dean didn't have much time left. His 78th birthday on June 7th had been a quiet affair. Just family, no big celebration. Dean had sat in his chair, acknowledged their presence, but seemed to be somewhere else entirely. The holidays approached with a sense of dread. Dean had always loved Christmas when the kids were young. He'd dress up as Santa Claus, hand out presents, sing carols. But after Dean Paul's death, Christmas became just another day to get through. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, several family members visited. They brought food, gifts, tried to create some semblance of holiday cheer. Dean smiled weakly, thanked them, but everyone could see he was exhausted. The simple act of sitting up to greet them took all his energy. His daughter Gail kissed his forehead before leaving. "I love you, Dad. Merry Christmas." Dean's response was barely audible. "Love you too, baby. You're a good girl." She didn't know those would be the last words she'd hear her father speak to her. Christmas morning, 1995. Dean's housekeeper, Consuela, arrived at 5:30 a.m. on Christmas morning. She'd been with Dean for years and had watched his decline with sadness. She found him awake, sitting in his chair by the window, looking out at the pre-dawn darkness. "Mr. Martin, can I get you something? Coffee? Breakfast?" Dean shook his head slowly. "No, thank you, Consuela. I'm just tired." She noticed his breathing was more labored than usual. "Should I call someone? Your daughter? The doctor?" "Not yet," Dean whispered. "Just let me sit here for a while." Consuela went to the kitchen, but kept checking on him every few minutes. At 6:15 a.m., she saw Dean's lips moving, like he was talking to someone. But there was no one else in the room. She moved closer, trying to hear what he was saying. The weight of 8 years. To understand Dean's final words, you need to understand what those 8 years since Dean Paul's death had been like for him. The grief hadn't lessened with time. It had grown heavier, more suffocating, more impossible to bear. Friends who visited during those years described a man haunted by memories. Dean would sometimes call out for Dean Paul in his sleep. He'd pick up the phone to call him before remembering. He kept Dean Paul's photograph on the table beside his chair and would talk to it sometimes, as if his son could hear him. The guilt was perhaps the worst part. Dean blamed himself for Dean Paul's death in ways that made no logical sense, but felt emotionally undeniable. He'd encouraged Dean Paul to pursue flying. He'd been proud when his son joined the Air National Guard. Now that pride felt like culpability. "I should have stopped him," Dean told Frank Sinatra during one of Frank's visits. "I should have told him it was too dangerous." "Dino, you couldn't have stopped him," Frank replied. "He was a grown man. He loved flying. It made him happy." "He's dead, Frank. Happy doesn't matter when you're dead." Frank had no answer for that. The physical pain. By Christmas 1995, Dean's body was failing in multiple ways. His emphysema made every breath a struggle. His kidneys were functioning at less than 30% capacity. His heart was weak from decades of smoking and drinking. He'd lost nearly 40 pounds from his peak weight, his frame skeletal beneath his pajamas. But the physical pain was almost secondary to the emotional anguish. Dean later told a nurse that the hardest part wasn't the difficulty breathing or the constant fatigue. It was waking up every morning and remembering, all over again, that Dean Paul was gone. "Every morning, for just a second, I forget," he'd said. "Then I remember, and it's like losing him all over again. Every single day." The nurses who cared for Dean in those final weeks said he rarely complained about physical discomfort. But he'd sometimes just sit there with tears running down his face, not making a sound, just crying silently while staring at Dean Paul's photograph. The isolation of grief, one of the most painful aspects of Dean's final years, was how isolated his grief made him. Even surrounded by family who loved him, Dean felt utterly alone in his pain. His other children tried to understand, but they were dealing with their own grief over losing their brother. They couldn't fully grasp the specific agony of a parent outliving a child, the fundamental wrongness of it, the way it violates the natural order of things. Friends tried to help, but what could they say? Every platitude. "He's in a better place. Time heals all wounds. You have to keep living for your other children," rang hollow against the crushing reality of Dean's loss. Dean's wife Jean, from whom he'd been divorced since 1973, understood better than most. She'd lost a son too, but even that shared grief couldn't fully bridge the distance. They'd talk occasionally, two people who'd once been everything to each other, now connected mainly by shared tragedy. The isolation deepened Dean's depression. He stopped answering the phone. He'd make excuses not to see visitors. He'd spend entire days without speaking to anyone except his housekeeper, and even those conversations were minimal. He was like a ghost, one friend told a reporter years later. Physically present, but spiritually absent. The Dean we knew had died with Dean Paul. What was left was just a shell, the memories that haunted him. In his final months, Dean's mind often drifted to the past. Not to his glory days as an entertainer, but to memories of Dean Paul. Teaching him to play golf. Watching him perform. The pride he'd felt when Dean Paul became a pilot. But the memories that haunted Dean most were the last conversations with his son. Their final phone call had been about nothing important, golf plans, family news, mundane father-son chat. Dean Paul had said, "Love you, Dad," before hanging up. Dean had replied, "Love you too, kiddo." Dean replayed that conversation endlessly. Had he told Dean Paul enough how proud he was? How much he loved him? Had Dean Paul truly known, how much he meant to his father? These questions tortured Dean because they could never be answered. Dean Paul was gone, and with him went any chance to say the things Dean wished he'd said more often, more clearly, more emphatically. The letting go. By Christmas Eve 1995, Dean seemed to have reached a decision. Several family members noticed a change in him. He was more peaceful, less agitated. It was as if he'd stopped fighting something and had simply accepted it. Deanna later said, "I think Dad had finally given himself permission to go. He'd held on for 8 years, partly because he knew we needed him, partly out of sheer stubborn will. But by that Christmas, he was done. He was ready." That night, alone in his room, Dean made peace with his life. He thought about his career, the hits, the movies, the performances. He thought about his marriages, his children, his friends. He thought about the Rat Pack days with Frank and Sammy. He thought about all the laughter, all the music, all the moments that had made up Dean Martin's life. But most of all, he thought about Dean Paul. And he thought about how tired he was of living without him. The final hours. Christmas morning dawned cold and clear in Beverly Hills. Dean had been awake since before sunrise, sitting in his chair, looking out the window at the empty street. Christmas lights twinkled on neighbors' houses. The world was celebrating, but Dean was saying goodbye. Around 6 a.m., his breathing became more labored. Consuela, the housekeeper, noticed immediately and moved closer to check on him. Dean's eyes were open, but he seemed to be looking at something she couldn't see. His lips were moving, forming words so softly that Consuela had to lean in close to hear. The final words. What Dean Martin said in those final moments has been reported by multiple sources who were there or spoke to those who were. Consuela heard it. The nurses who arrived shortly after heard Dean repeat it. And his family, when told later, recognized it immediately as the deepest truth of who Dean had become after his son's death. Dean's final words, whispered in the early morning of December 25th, 1995, were, "I'm coming, kiddo. Dad's coming. Save me a seat." He repeated it several times, his voice getting weaker with each repetition. "Coming, kiddo. Dad's coming." Then at approximately 3:30 a.m., accounts vary slightly, Dean Paul Martin, Dino Crocetti, the king of cool, the voice that had sung, "Everybody loves somebody, and that's amore," the man who'd made millions laugh and sing and dream, took his final breath. He died alone in his chair, looking out the window, with Dean Paul's photograph in his lap and his son's name on his lips. The discovery. Consuela realized Dean had passed when she came to check on him at 6:45 a.m. and saw that his breathing had stopped. She called for the nurse, who confirmed what was already evident. Dean was gone. The nurse then called Deanna, who rushed over immediately. When she arrived and learned about her father's final words, she broke down completely. "He never stopped being Dean Paul's father," she said through tears. "That was his identity more than anything else. And now they're together again." The official cause of death was listed as acute respiratory failure due to emphysema and lung cancer. But everyone who knew Dean understood the real cause. A broken heart that had been failing for 8 years. The news spreads. Word of Dean's death spread quickly through Hollywood and then to the world. It was Christmas Day, a detail that seemed almost cruel in its irony. Dean, who'd once loved Christmas so much, had died on the holiday he'd come to dread. Frank Sinatra, 80 years old and in poor health himself, wept when he heard. "My brother's gone," he told his wife Barbara. "First Dean Paul, now Dino. I can't do this anymore." Frank would die just 2.5 years later, in May 1998. Friends said he never recovered from losing Dean. Jerry Lewis, Dean's former comedy partner with whom he'd had a complicated on-and-off relationship, released a statement. "Dean was the best partner I ever had. We had our differences, but I loved him. I'll miss him every day." Sammy Davis Jr. had died in 1990, so the Rat Pack, that symbol of eternal youth and brotherhood, was now reduced to memories and old recordings. The funeral. Dean's funeral was held on December 28th at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery. It was a private affair, just family and close friends. Dean had left instructions that he wanted no big production, no public spectacle. Just a simple goodbye. But it was impossible to keep it completely private. Fans gathered outside the cemetery gates. Media trucks lined the streets. The world wanted to say goodbye to the king of cool. Frank Sinatra attended, though he was visibly struggling with his own health issues. He sat through the service in silence, tears streaming down his face, saying nothing. Those who saw him said he looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. The service was short. Dean's children spoke briefly about their father. Not about his career or fame, but about him as a dad. Deanna shared the story of Dean's final words, and there wasn't a dry eye in the chapel. "Dad spent his last 8 years missing Dean Paul," Deanna said. "But now they're together again. I have to believe that. I have to believe Dad is finally at peace, finally with the son he loved so much." The burial. Dean Martin was buried in a plot not far from Marilyn Monroe at Westwood Village Memorial Park. His headstone is simple, elegant, with just his name and dates. Dean Martin, June 7, 1917 to December 25, 1995. But visitors to his grave often leave offerings that reflect his image. Bottles of Jack Daniels, playing cards, golf balls. These items celebrate the persona Dean created, the cool, carefree entertainer. What they don't see is what Dean carried inside. The grief, the love, the pain of outliving a child. That private Dean, the one who whispered, "I'm coming, kiddo," in his final moments, is the one his family remembers most. What Dean's final words teach us. Dean Martin's last words, "I'm coming, kiddo. Dad's coming," reveals several profound truths about love, loss, and what really matters at the end of our lives. 1. Love doesn't end with death. Dean spent 8 years mourning his son. He never got over it. He never moved on. The grief was as raw on his final day as it had been the day Dean Paul died. But that grief was also a testament to love. Dean's pain came from love so deep, so fundamental, that losing Dean Paul felt like losing part of himself. His final words showed that this love transcended death, that Dean believed he'd see his son again, that the relationship would continue. We live in a culture that tells us to get over losses, to move forward, to find closure. Dean's story reminds us that some losses can't be gotten over. Some love is too deep for closure. And that's okay. 2. Our children define us more than our achievements. Dean Martin had an incredible career. Hit records, successful films, a legendary television show, sold-out concerts around the world. He'd achieved everything a performer could dream of achieving. But in his final moments, he wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about his son. His identity as Dean Paul's father mattered more than his identity as Dean Martin entertainer. This teaches us something vital about priorities. At the end, the awards don't matter. The fame doesn't matter. The money doesn't matter. What matters is the people we love and the relationships we've built. 3. Grief is not something to overcome. Our society treats grief like a problem to be solved or an illness to be cured. We expect people to grieve for an appropriate amount of time, then return to normal. Dean's 8 years of grief challenged this expectation. He never returned to normal because his normal had been destroyed. He learned to exist with the grief, to carry it, but never to eliminate it. His final words showed that he'd been waiting 8 years for the moment he could be reunited with his son. That's not pathological grief. That's a father who loved his child so much that living without him felt impossible. 4. The cool exterior often hides deep feeling. For decades, Dean cultivated an image of effortless cool. Nothing bothered him. Everything rolled off his back. He was the guy who made it all look easy. But that image was just that, an image. The real Dean felt deeply, loved fiercely, and grieved devastatingly. His final words stripped away the cool persona and revealed the vulnerable, heartbroken father underneath. How many people in our lives are hiding similar pain behind calm exteriors? How many cool people are secretly carrying grief we can't see? Dean's story reminds us to look deeper, to recognize that everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about. 5. Hope matters, even at the end. Dean's final words weren't just about grief. They were about hope. "I'm coming, kiddo. Dad's coming. He believed he'd see Dean Paul again. That belief gave him comfort in his final moments. Whether you believe in an afterlife or not, Dean's hope teaches us something important. The beliefs that comfort us at the end are the ones we should hold on to throughout our lives. Don't wait until you're dying to think about what matters most. The legacy Dean left. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day 1995, but his legacy extends far beyond his entertainment career. His final words teach us to love fiercely and unashamedly, to acknowledge that some losses change us forever, to recognize that grief is love that has nowhere to go, to prioritize relationships over achievements, to hold on to hope even in the darkest moments. What we can learn. Dean's story asks us some uncomfortable questions. Are we telling the people we love how much they matter to us? Are we prioritizing career success over the relationships that will actually matter at the end? Are we present with our children, or are we too busy building a legacy that won't comfort us when we're dying? Are we so focused on looking cool or strong that we're not being honest about our pain? Dean Martin had everything the world says should make you happy: fame, fortune, talent, success. But what he wanted most in his final moments was simply to be with his son. That's a powerful reminder of what truly matters. Your turn. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that love transcends death, that grief is a testament to love, and that what matters at the end is not what we achieved, but who we loved. Drop a comment below. Who would you want to see again if you believed in a reunion after death? Don't wait. Tell the people you love that they matter to you. Today. Now. Because none of us knows how much time we have. Dean Martin's final words. I'm coming, kiddo. Dad's coming. Remind us that at the end of our lives, nothing matters more than the people we love. Don't wait until your final moments to realize that truth. Live it today. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the untold stories that remind us what really matters in life.